started these conferences in 2006, was the 10th anniversary of the start of the public hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I want to say something very specific about the kinds of people who come to these conferences. You will notice that one of the things that you do at these conferences is to invite victims, survivors, children of victims and survivors, so that we have a sense of what is it that our theories are saying and how in relation to the experiences, the direct experiences of people who have suffered these traumas.
I heard a little bit of the story, like I didn't hear the story, but I heard that, Eugene de Kock had killed my father and there was a picture of my father's body in this book. So one day I decided when my mom wasn't around that I was going to turn to the page that I'd overheard. And I opened the book and it was my father's burnt body clutching a steering wheel. So I shut the book very quickly and I threw it back because I couldn't tell my mom that I had gone and looked for this picture. And it was something that had stuck with me. And as I grew old, I became more and more resentful, firstly because I couldn't speak about it. And as I was growing, I just grew so angry at Eugene. And every time I'd think of him, I'd literally go into palpitations. I'd break out into a sweat. And I think it was when I was 16 that I thought I was having a heart attack in the middle of the night. So my mom rushed me to hospital, and as we got there, the doctor just put me under anesthetic, and he said, you're not having a heart attack, but we need to put you under to see what is happening with your body. And they put me under gastroscopy, which is when they put the camera down your throat. And the results came back, and he said, look, Candace, I don't know how to tell you this, but you were not having a heart attack, but you display the symptoms of someone triple your age. He said, you are depressed, you have ulcers. He's like, I don't know how else to tell you, but your body's slowly killing you. And that is when it really sunk in, that I was beginning to die in a lot of ways.
I was 5 years old when my mom gave me money to buy sweets. When I come back, my mom was gone. She didn't greet me, didn't hug me, didn't kiss me. My father became an alcoholic. I went to an orphanage. So to receive love, attention from young, I became part of the Israel Vision, AWB, and specifically the Witwolde. To be part of that family of love, I was prepared to kill people.
Stefan's Kutzer, in the session just before this, he was one of the Worcester bombers, was asked about love, and he said in response that the three things he's come to rely on are being humble, patient, and kind. So we've been thinking, but we've been also, in ways that I know many of us have found absolutely overwhelming, been reliving the trauma, reliving with the trauma of some of the people who have spoken over the last few days.
So when we met in a conference room in the prison, and then he was shuffled in. And I remember also just looking at him, but unlike Derby Lewis, Janusz was still very much manful in his prime, because I think he was in early 40s when it happened. And he was very, very strong, and he seemed very resilient. And I remember saying to myself, if he makes eye contact, keep the eye contact. Don't show him your vulnerability. And so we were introduced, and it was across the room, and we sat down, and I decided that I'm going to pretend that no one's there. And because of the background of Narcotics Anonymous and AA, where we're told to rather see the similarities rather than the differences in people, I went in with that mentality. So I began to ask him questions of his childhood, because I really wanted to know this person. So I started from his childhood, and as he was telling me about his life in Poland and how his father was a businessman and how they were always harassed by the government, the communist government, because his father was a businessman, I remember thinking, oh, that's quite parallel to my life. We were also harassed by the South African government. And as he was going through his life, I just realized that we share quite a few childhood memories and of how we grew up. He also had a happy childhood. I remember trying to use Psychology 101. I asked him, did you hunt? Did you torture animals? You know, because I was trying to think, are you a psychopath? You know, but none of that came across. He had a seemingly happy childhood.
And then what was the conversation that connected you to the daughter of Valush?
Well, as we went along with the conversation, the people who were sitting around the table, namely Melinda, got impatient. And then she just blurted out, "Just tell us about the day you killed Chris." And then we all were startled a bit. And then he started to tell us about the 10th of April. And I remember just holding onto the chair so tightly because I was trying to not show emotion. And as he was talking, he told me how he watched us before. And he would see my father jogging and me cycling behind him. And he would watch our family come and go and how happy we seemed. And he said that on the day of the 10th of April, he watched my dad go for his usual jog, and he followed him, watched him come back to the house, and he was ringing the doorbell to tell my sister that it's time to go to the hair salon. And he said, as my dad did that, he walked up to him, and he wanted to make sure that it's him. So he called his name. He said, "Chris." And he says, "Did he?" Then turned around and smiled and said, "Yes." And he said, "That's when I shot him." And then he spoke about how Diddy went down, but he didn't die immediately. And then he says, "I walked up to him, stood over him, and shot him again." And he told me in that matter of fact, and it was incredibly, incredibly hard to hear. But at the same time, I was so grateful to hear it because I never knew what happened that day. And I said to him, "Did you know my sister was at home?" And he said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "I wasn't meant to pull the trigger that weekend. I was told not to. But I saw an opportunity and I took it." And I said, "Why did you have to shoot him so many times?" And he said, "I had to follow my orders. I had to complete," and it was his words, "I had to complete my mission."
Here, in a way, I think the conference has enacted an answer to its own question about reparation, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Because, like the ancestors, it has demonstrated that the past, in fact, if you're Achille Mbembe, the present, permanent present of inequality, neoliberalism, and continuing injustice, not only in relationship to land, nothing has gone away. And the repetition of these conferences, the commitment to a continuation of them, is surely at least partly a way of keeping track of that painful reality which goes on being in need of acknowledgement.
First of all, it can be said that modern African and diasporic thought has been, for the most part, a long meditation on the reality of trauma. The trauma of the world and the world as trauma. It has been a long meditation on what it is to live with trauma and on how to return to life after trauma. You can look into this archive, whether in terms of writings, in terms of music, in terms of artistic creativity. This is a theme that is saturating this archive.
I've been very struck by the presence of the dream, and again, if I can refer to your conversation yesterday, it was only when I bumped into Dorothy in the street today that she explained to me very carefully which dream was which dream.
There's a street in Craddock where the stadium where my husband and others were like having the funeral service. There's a stadium. There's a church, the Anglican church on the other side. So there's a street here in between, Ines Daly Street. Just opposite the church, that is where, in the dream, where me and my husband met. And he was like coming, rushing, and he said, "No, Monday I was coming to you." And I was like, what is going on? He said, they are killing us again. And I was like, where is Matthew and the others? And he said, no, they hide there in another shop. And I was like, where? He said, there in another shop. And say, okay, let's go. And while we turned to go back home, I woke up. And I was like, this is a dream. Until this other lady called and said, Sis Nomonde, when last were you at the gravesite? And then I said, no, I didn't go. For the past 2 weeks, I didn't go there. And she said, you better come. So me and Tumani, immediately we went to the gravesite. Is where we saw that the graves were vandalized with big stones. And those graves are protected. There's a gate around it. It's like they are really protected, but the graves were vandalized.
We have repeatedly come up against the limits of what we can bear to talk about. At moments I felt we slightly downplayed the dark, just slightly, not the dark of what people are capable of, but the dark of the confrontation with the self. Because it is, of course, and I think again this is what Mark was talking about, the hardest thing of all. And I can't remember who it was who talked about the mystery of genocide. And I found myself thinking it would be no mystery to Freud. It would be no mystery to psychoanalysis. And that was what Chabani Manganyi is talking about in his book when he says violent reverie is the space of knowing that you kill and be killed. I say violent reverie is the space of experiencing the dark night of the soul. One other thing that has, I'll come back to that in a minute, one other thing that's really struck me here is a difference between the way in which this domain, which has brought with it ghosts, secrets, pasts, it's been touched on in your discussion yesterday, but also in Jaco's discussion, Jaco Bernard-Naude and Kathy Caru's discussion, the encounter with the past as a form of ghostliness.
I'm increasingly convinced that the word reparation should be reserved strictly to refer to the name of a ghost, of a spectre. Derrida used to say that one can never be sure whether a spectre is coming from the past or from the future, and that this means that the spectre creates a disjuncture in time. The wager of my argument is that an encounter with the spectre of reparation might disjoin time in such a way that what is conjured in a present that is not identical to itself is not reparation, but the reparative. The reparative, therefore, is that which could arise from the haunting of reparation's spectre.
And a sense that justice will only arise when there is an appropriate public commemoration of the dead. And I think a number of people have said that, whether it's to do with the bringing up of the bones of the Gukurandi massacre, or whether it's some other idea of confrontation with the dead and respect for and acknowledgement for what had happened. As if, despite the TRC, despite the attempts at rememorialization, there is still work to be done. And I'm just struck, listening to people like Sia and Doreen Mogaduko, and listening to Namonda and Tumani, that they were left alone with their private grief, whilst a public event has not been allowed to take place, as if the private is the only place you can go. There is no one to talk to. Namanda, as I think you said, there was no one for you to go and say, look what's happened to me, I want to talk about this. And I was just very struck, Namanda, by what you said about being a woman and being a mother, and how you had to put up your face. There was no room for grief, because to be a mother was to be invincible and perfect and strong. And I think you said, and I think Doreen McWoke also said this, that it was an injunction from the liberation movement that there should be no affect. That is to say, you were not allowed to show your pain. And that's the opposite of using women's suffering as a trope for resistance. In either case, the woman's relationship to her pain is being silenced and not being properly listened to. And I especially loved what you said at the end, which is, it is your time now. So I think along with the need for restitution and land reform, which has been so brilliantly talked about on this panel so far. There must be room for a psychic space which both acknowledges the dream and what it carries by way of historical memory and sets women like you free. Thank you.
Thank you.